soldiers and what African-American soldiers did.
What's Ulysses S. Grant's story? What do you learn from him? Was he a hero or a villain of this war?
I think he's a hero, though he's a flawed hero, as all heroes are. He's a man from Ohio and Illinois who was really a failed businessman time and again, and had an ability to command people in war. Where did this come from? He was a clear communicator and an empathetic figure. He tended to drink too much, but he was the kind of person people wanted to follow. They trusted him. And so in battle, that became very important. And the second thing is he did his homework. And he had a sense of the terrain. He had a sense of the environment he was operating in. And he was ruthless in pursuing what he had studied. So he turns out at battles as like Vicksburg and elsewhere to actually undertake some pretty revolutionary maneuvers. And then he figures out that the advantage now is on his side in numbers. And he just pounds Lee. Pounds him to death, similar to what the United States does at the end of World War II with Germany and Japan. He comes out of the war, Grant does. He's a believer in union. He wants to protect former slaves and other groups, and he tries to use the military for that purpose. He's limited. And then as president, he tries to do that as well. Right now, we still use many of the laws that were passed during Grant's presidency to prosecute insurrectionists. So the 900 or so people who have been prosecuted for breaking into the Capitol and attacking police on January 6th, those insurrectionists, they've been prosecuted under the 1871 anti-Ku Klux Klan law. So that's a big accomplishment by Grant, and we still benefit from it. The problem is Grant was not a great politician. Unlike Lincoln, he didn't give good speeches. He wasn't a persuasive figure in a political space. And so he had trouble building support for what he was doing, even though he was trying to do what in the end I think were the right things.
What was the role of the KKK at that time?
So the Ku Klux Klan is formed at the end of the Civil War by Confederate veterans, first in Tennessee, in Pulaski, Tennessee, and then it spreads elsewhere. And there are other groups that are similar, the Red Shirts and various others. These are veterans of the Confederate Army who come home and are committed to continuing the war. They are going to use their power at home and their weapons to intimidate and, if necessary, kill people who challenge their authority. Not just African Americans, Jews, Catholics, various others. They are going to basically protect the continued rule of the same families who owned the slaves before in post-slavery Tennessee and post-slavery South Carolina. And when we get to voting, they're often the groups that are preventing people from voting. The white sheets and the ritual around that was all an effort to provide a certain ritualistic legitimacy and hide identity, though everyone knew who they were.
Oh, so that whole brand, that whole practice was there from the beginning.
Very beginning.
Have you studied the KKK's history a little bit?
I have, and there are a number of other historians who have too, so I've used their research as well.
I'm kind of curious. I have to admit that my knowledge of it is very kind of caricature knowledge. I'm sure there's interesting stories and threads because I think there's different competing organizations or something like that.
Of course.
Within the United States. And I feel like through that lens, you can tell a story of the United States also of these different
They're
groups.
often business associations. I mean, there's a lot of work showing that actually people join the KKK for the reasons I just laid out, but also because it was networking for your business. You gained legitimacy in the area that you were in. So these were community groups that were formed to help white business people. They helped white sheriffs get elected. What we have to understand today is when we're debating policing, this history matters enormously, right? I have nothing against police. My cousin, one of my closest relatives, just retired from 25 years in the New York Police Department. Thank God he survived. I have deep respect. He's one of the best public servants I know. But what we also have to recognize as we respect police officers is that for many communities in our country, they know this history. And the KKK in the 1870s and in the 1930s, you look at any KKK organization, as I have in my research, and you find the police chiefs are the KKK members, the local police officers, local judges, because it was how you became police chief.
So these groups infiltrated some of the main institutions in our nation.
I don't even think they infiltrated. I think they were part of those institutions.
The deeper question today in the 21st century is, one, how much of that is still there and how much of the history of that reverberates through the institutions.
And I'm making the latter point, that it's not there that much now, but people remember it,
And
that
some
matters.
people would even say it's not there at all, that there is not institutional racism in policing. But if that's the case, then you can also say that if there is not direct institutional racism, there, what is it? The echoes of history still have effects.
Of course, and that's really important, and that we have to take that seriously. That's not an excuse for people then saying nasty things about the police,
Yeah.
but it is what we have to recognize. Look, I'm Jewish, and there are certain elements of Russian behavior today I see in Ukraine that reverberate with the history of how my grandparents dealt with pogroms in Russia. Right, even though what Putin is doing in Ukraine might not technically be a pogrom, that history matters in how I view these issues. And that's a reality.
Yeah, I went to 7-Eleven recently, and what did I eat? I ate one of their salads. I'm sorry, I love 7-Eleven. I'm sorry. I ate one of the salads and got like terrible food poisoning.
Oh,
I was suffering for like 4 days, and now I can't. I love 7-Eleven. I love going to 7-Eleven late at night in sweatpants and just I escape the world. I'm listening to an audiobook, and now every time I pass that salad, for the rest of my life, I would have hate for that salad. So history matters, even
yeah.
if the salad is no longer have any bad stuff in it. It's probably the lettuce or something, whatever. Mostly for humor's sake, but I'm also giving a kind of metaphor that history can have an individual and a large scale society effect on human interactions, both the good and the bad. If you actually recommend to me offline books on the KKK, that would be really
Happy to. There were a few mentioned in the footnotes in my book here.
and also in part because I also want to understand the white nationalism, white supremacist, Christian supremacist, or Christian nationalism, all those different subgroups in the United States and elsewhere in the world. My mind has been focused on some of the better aspects of human nature. That it's nice to also understand some of the darker aspects. Let me ask you sort of a personal question for me. Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's useful to do a podcast conversation with somebody like David Duke or somebody that everybody knows? So it's not like you're giving a platform to somebody that's a hidden um, member of the KKK, or like it's a sort of putting a pretty face on some dark ideas, but everybody knows. And so now you're just exploring, you're sitting across the table, maybe not in his case, maybe somebody who's an active KKK member sitting across from a person that literally hates me, Lex.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's fascinating to
I do
explore
too.
that mind.
I think so long as what you are doing is not boosting someone, so taking an obscure figure
Sure.
and making that figure now famous.
Yes.
But if it's someone who's already infamous,
Yeah.
and it helps us to understand them, and as so long as your effort is to ask them tough questions, which you do, right? You don't give them all the questions in advance. You don't have limitations on what you can ask. So long as it is a real interview, not pablum, then I'm for it. What I'm against is a softball interview
Yeah.
that allows someone to sound reasonable when they're not. But the way I've seen you do this, when you've had figures like that, I won't name who I have in mind, but when I've seen that, is I think that's useful because honestly, the historian in me and the citizen in me wants to understand. My Jewish grandfather always was the first to be against any effort to suppress anti-Semites because his view was he wanted to know who they were and he wanted to know what they thought so he could be prepared.
And I also see, like, perhaps as a historian, you may be able to appreciate this kind of thing. That's probably how you see the world. But there's several ways to see a human being, like Vladimir Putin is an example. One is a political figure that's currently doing actions in the world, geopolitics, internally, the politics of Russia. But there's also that human being in a historical context. And collecting information about that person in the historical context is also very valuable. Yeah. So you could see interviews with Hitler in 39, 40, 41 as being very bad and detrimental to all that is good in the world. But at the same time, it's important to understand that human mind, how power affects that mind, how power corrupts it, how they see the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would be all in favor